There was a stench so thick in the air, even the servants covered their faces with cloth. The king was rotting while still alive, hidden behind the velvet curtains of his chamber. England's most powerful monarch lay swollen, breathless, and screaming in his sleep. The once proud frame of Henry VIII, once admired for his strength and beauty, had become a mountain of decaying flesh, a corpse trapped in a breathing body. His leg, wrapped in layers of linen, oozed a yellow-green pus that soaked through every morning. The doctors dared not speak of gangrene, not to the king. No one told the truth anymore. His screams were nightly. Loud, panicked, deep howls of fear and pain echoed through the stone walls of Whitehall Palace. He cried out names of dead wives, Catherine, Anne, Jane. Sometimes he spoke to them as if they stood beside him. Sometimes he cursed them as if they were witches returned to haunt him. The maids whispered that he spoke with the devil, that he called out to ghosts. Some said he begged for forgiveness. Others said he laughed while describing their executions. And when the candlelight flickered at night, casting long shadows against the damp stone walls, those shadows looked like women, their heads tilted unnaturally to one side, their faces pale and distant, as if they were watching. He had loved them once, or so he said. Now they lived only in portraits, hung in rooms he no longer entered. He had ordered 2 of them killed with his own seal, their necks taken clean by cold blades. Yet it wasn't guilt that seemed to be eating him alive. It was something darker, something deeper. Not regret, but fear. His body had swollen to such a grotesque size that special pulleys had to be installed just to lift him from bed. He could barely walk. The royal tailor could no longer find cloth wide enough for his waist. Food still came in mountains: goose legs, puddings, meat pies, but he barely ate, chewing slowly, distracted by unseen things. Some nights, he sat in silence for hours, staring at nothing. On others, he gripped his bedposts and shouted for executioners, for swords, for flames. "Let them burn," he would cry. "Let them all burn." No one knew who he meant, but everyone feared it. The truth was this: Henry VIII, once the mightiest king in Christendom, had become a prisoner of his own mind, trapped in a decaying temple of flesh and lies, surrounded by servants too afraid to speak, too afraid to look directly at him. They said his eyes no longer looked human, bloodshot, watery, always searching the shadows. A priest came to offer comfort. Henry threw a cup at him that he would not speak of heaven. He would not speak of death, but death was coming. One winter night, the silence grew louder than the screams. The air hung heavy with the smell of rotting wounds. The fire crackled, but no one felt warm. His final moments were not glorious. There were no noble speeches, no family gathered. Only a fading man in soaked linens, weeping, twitching, gasping for air. The King of England died in fear, but this is not the story of how Henry died. This is the story of why he became a monster. Why the boy who once danced in golden halls, who rode stallions across green fields, who wrote music and loved poetry, chose to murder his own wives. Not 1, not 2, but 6. And why the true reason behind those killings is darker than you were ever told. Stay with me, because to understand the end, you must first see the rise, and to understand his cruelty, you must first feel his charm. Let's go back before the screams, before the blood, before the throne turned into a tomb, before the name Henry VIII became a warning in the history books. He wasn't supposed to be king. Henry was the second son, the spare, not the heir. Born in 1491, he grew up in the shadow of his older brother, Arthur, who was groomed for the throne from birth. Henry, meanwhile, was free to read, free to ride, free to charm. His early years weren't clouded by pressure or politics. Instead, he lived like a golden prince in a kingdom of pageantry and power. From the beginning, Henry stood out. He was tall, unusually tall for his time, broad-shouldered, and strikingly handsome. People whispered about his golden hair and deep blue eyes. He moved with the grace of a knight and the energy of a wild stallion. He could fence, wrestle, joust, and play tennis with elegance and fury. Even his enemies couldn't help but admire him. But Henry wasn't just physical strength. He was incredibly intelligent. He spoke Latin, French, and Spanish. He composed music. He wrote poetry. He debated philosophy. And he loved theology. Not in the dry, dull way of scholars, but in the passionate, personal way of someone who truly believed he had a divine purpose. He was charming too, more than charming, magnetic. When he walked into a room, all eyes turned. He laughed loudly, he sang, he danced, and he loved deeply, obsessively, like a boy chasing perfection. When his brother Arthur suddenly died at the age of 15, everything changed. The crown, once so distant, now hovered above Henry's head. He was only 10 years old when the burden of the future was silently passed to him. His childhood vanished overnight. The carefree boy became a political prize. Every move, every tutor, every conversation was now a preparation for rule. Then, in 1509, at just 17 years old, Henry became King of England. People rejoiced that the bells rang for hours, for England. This was the dawn of a golden age. This was the dawn of a golden age. Stepped onto the throne, not as a cold strategist or a power-hungry prince, but as a beautiful, beloved, idealistic young king. A king who believed in justice, a king who wanted to be loved, a king who believed God had chosen him, and he married the same year to a woman who had once been his brother's bride, Catherine of Aragon. Daughter of the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, became his queen. She was graceful, educated, and devoted to Henry. Their early years were filled with love, laughter, and mutual admiration. She had suffered loss. He had inherited glory. Together, they were the golden couple. Henry loved being king. Not just the power, but the image, the parades, the tournaments, the crowds shouting his name. He became obsessed with chivalry, knighthood, Arthurian legend. He saw himself not just as a ruler, as a living myth, a man destined to shine through the ages. In those first 10 years, he invested in music, architecture, diplomacy, revived the English Navy, poured money into the arts. He wrote treatises defending the Catholic Church. He was called the Defender of the Faith by the Pope himself. Europe admired him. England adored him. Beneath the pageantry, one problem began to grow. A problem that would slowly turn love into hate, reason into obsession, and a dream into a nightmare. Henry needed an heir. More specifically, Henry needed a son. Catherine bore him children, many. Most died in infancy. One daughter, Mary, survived, but no sons, no living male heir. And in Henry's mind, this wasn't just bad luck, it was a sign, a punishment. Something was wrong. Something was cursed. He began to fear that he had made a mistake by marrying his brother's widow, that God was angry, that he had broken a sacred rule. His love for Catherine began to crack. Through that crack, the darkness would enter. At first, he hid it well, still held tournaments, still wrote poetry, still embraced the glory of kingship. The people still loved him, had no idea the seeds of destruction already growing in their golden king's heart. Henry didn't just want a son. He needed a son to feel immortal. To feel godlike. To feel safe. And in that desperation, Henry's light began to flicker. His charm, his beauty, his brilliance, none of it mattered if he couldn't secure the future of the Tudor dynasty. Dream of eternal glory began to twist. King who once wrote love letters would soon sign death warrants. In these early years, this golden period, Henry VIII was everything a king was meant to be. Strong, beautiful, proud, loved, worshipped. He believed in honor. He believed in love. He believed in God. And he believed that God believed in him. He was chosen, but the rules did not apply to him. It was this belief, this dangerous, glowing confidence that would one day burn through every boundary, mercy, loyalty, and reason. For now, England still danced. Henry still smiled. History still held its breath. As kings may rise like gods, they fall like men. It began, as great downfalls often do, with a longing that turned into obsession. By the late 1520s, Henry had been king for nearly 2 decades. He was still strong, still proud, still surrounded by splendor. But inside him, something had changed. His eyes were sharper, his tone harder, his patience thinner. Dream of kingship had become a cage. His world narrowed to one relentless thought: must have a son. Catherine of Aragon, once the love of his youth, had grown older, hair grayed, body weary from repeated childbirth. The warmth between them had cooled. She remained a devoted queen-wise, respected, loyal, but in Henry's eyes, she failed her purpose. As her womb failed, Henry's desperation grew. He searched the Bible for answers, found a passage in Leviticus that haunted him. If a man takes his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. Shall be childless. Henry, this was no coincidence. It was divine judgment. He began to believe that his marriage to Catherine had damned him. God himself was denying him a son because of this unholy union. But God wasn't the only force pulling at Henry's soul. There was also Anne Boleyn. She was everything. Catherine was not. Young, sharp, witty, ambitious, mysterious. She had dark, intelligent eyes and a voice that could slice through pride. Anne wasn't like the other ladies at court. She didn't giggle and swoon. She didn't throw herself at the king. She challenged him. She rejected him at first. And that rejection drove Henry mad with desire. He became obsessed. He wrote her over a dozen passionate letters. He promised her love. He promised her marriage. He promised her the crown. Anne didn't give herself freely. She knew what she was doing. She played a dangerous game, and Henry, a king unaccustomed to being denied, fell harder every day. By 1527, Henry had made up his mind. He would divorce Catherine, marry Anne, and finally produce the male heir God had denied him. But there was a problem, a very big one. The Pope said no. Divorce was not simple in the 16th century. For a king, it was a public, political, and spiritual earthquake. Catherine was the daughter of Spain's most powerful rulers and the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. To allow her humiliation would risk the wrath of Europe. The Pope stalled, delayed, evaded. He would not grant the annulment, but Henry VIII was not a man who tolerated no. This is where everything turned. What began as a personal crisis soon became a national one. Henry broke from the Catholic Church. He declared that the Pope had no authority in England. He crowned himself the supreme head of the Church of England. This was not just divorce. This was revolution. Henry had unleashed a storm. Monasteries were destroyed. Ancient traditions collapsed. Priests were forced to swear loyalty to the crown or die. The English Reformation had begun, not for theology, but for lust, for pride, and for a son that had not yet been born. In 1533, Anne Boleyn became queen. Her coronation was grand, defiant, and unprecedented. She was not beloved like Catherine. She was seen as an intruder, a temptress, a usurper. But Henry adored her, at least for a while. When Anne became pregnant, the court buzzed with excitement. Henry was convinced it would be a boy. He even had the birth announcement prepared. But when the child was born, it was a girl, a healthy, strong girl named Elizabeth, but a girl nonetheless. Henry's smile faded. He masked his disappointment in public, but behind the palace doors, something cracked. Anne tried again and again. But like Catherine, her pregnancies ended in tragedy, miscarriages, stillbirths, no son. Henry's obsession turned to rage, began to question whether Anne too had been cursed, whether this second marriage, this second queen, was also a sin. He had broken the church, alienated half of Europe, destroyed lives for what? For more dead children? Anne was no longer untouchable. Her sharp tongue, once alluring, now grated. Her ambition, once admired, now seemed arrogant. The court turned against her. Whispers of treason, witchcraft, and adultery began to spread. Some claimed she had bewitched the king. Others said she had been unfaithful with Henry's closest friends. The charges were wild, inconsistent, almost impossible to believe. But Henry believed them, or chose to, because belief in that moment was convenient. And in 1536, just 3 years after she had become queen, Anne Boleyn was arrested. She was taken to the Tower of London. She protested her innocence to the end. She wept. She prayed. She wrote letters to Henry, letters that were never answered. She was found guilty by a jury of noblemen, too afraid to say otherwise, and she was executed with one clean stroke of a French sword. Her head was severed from her body. The same man who once called her the love of his life had her killed. It was the second time Henry had watched a crown fall from a queen's head. But it wouldn't be the last. Shortly after Anne's death, Henry married again, this time to Jane Seymour, a quiet and obedient woman who seemed to offer peace. Within a year, she gave Henry what he had always wanted, a son. Edward. The long-awaited heir. Henry was overjoyed. He celebrated wildly. He kissed his newborn son's face and declared him the future of England. But fate, once again, was cruel. Jane Seymour died just days later. Complications from childbirth took her life. Henry was devastated. He wore mourning clothes for months. He called her his true wife, but even joy had begun to feel like punishment. And with each wife, each loss, each betrayal, Henry grew colder, more paranoid. More controlling. His body, once admired for its power and beauty, began to swell. His leg, injured during a jousting accident in 1536, the same year Anne was executed, never healed properly. The wound became infected. It festered. It reopened constantly. Pain was excruciating. He could no longer ride. Horses. No longer dance. King, who once dazzled the world with his presence, now limped from room to room. His mind followed. For once there had been poetry, there was now suspicion. For once he trusted his advisors, he now spied on them. He had once loved deeply, now he ruled with fear. He married again, and again, and again. 6 wives in total. 2 were executed. 1 died in childbirth. 2 were cast aside. Only 1 outlived him. Each marriage began with hope and ended in shadows. And behind it all was that single fatal desire, a son. Henry's world had changed. The man who had once united church and crown, who had loved music and beauty in life, had become something else. A man who could no longer love without destroying. A man who believed in divine punishment, but saw sin only in others. A man who had rewritten the rules of heaven just to get what he wanted, and in doing so, began to lose everything. This was the turning point. The beginning of the end. The Golden Prince had become a storm in human form, and the damage was just beginning. By 1540s, Henry VIII no longer resembled a king. He resembled a man being slowly consumed by his own body, by the weight of his choices, by the ghosts that whispered in the quiet corners of his court. Once golden-haired Prince of England had become something grotesque, bloated, foul-smelling, deformed. A man who once rode stallions across green fields, dazzled courts with music and laughter, could now barely walk a few steps without gasping for air. His legs had become monstrous. A wound on his left leg, the same one from the jousting accident years before, had never healed. Instead, it grew deeper, more infected, more horrifying. Pus oozed daily from the open sore, staining his bedsheets yellow and green. The ulcer festered like a mouth on his flesh. Surgeons would drain it with knives while he screamed through clenched teeth, and yet it always returned. Always worse. The smell, they said, was unbearable. The entire palace reeked of rot. Servants burned herbs and scented oils. Nothing masked it. Ambassadors from other kingdoms rode home, describing the king's stench with disgust. "Smells of death," one wrote. Foreign guests stood at a distance. Some refused to kneel near him. Even his courtiers, those paid to adore him, turned faces slightly when he passed. No one dared speak it aloud, because Henry still ruled with absolute power. Even as his body decayed, his paranoia grew sharper. Trusted no one. His counselors were constantly replaced, executed, disgraced. Believed his enemies were everywhere. Believed his past wives haunted his future. Believed that betrayal waited in every hallway. He had once loved women. Now he feared them. After Jane Seymour's death, he married Anne of Cleves. He claimed she disgusted him on sight. Divorced her in 6 months. Then came Catherine Howard, only a teenager when she caught Henry's eye. Young, playful, beautiful, danced and giggled in the palace halls like a songbird. For a moment, it seemed Henry's heart softened, and the rumors came that he had known other men. She had written letters. She had laughed at the old king behind his back. Whether true or not, it didn't matter. Henry had her arrested, dragged from her bed, screaming and weeping. She was beheaded in 1542. He was just 19. After her death, something broke in Henry permanently. He stopped celebrating, stopped smiling, stopped pretending. He withdrew into shadows. 2. Chambers darkened by thick curtains and flickering candlelight. Rarely left his bed. Leg wound had now tunneled deep into the bone. Gangrene had taken hold. Surgeons whispered about amputation, but they knew such a procedure would kill him. They cleaned, they drained, they wrapped and unwrapped. All the while, the king screamed. He screamed in pain, screamed in rage, screamed in nightmares. Dreams were worse than the pain. Dreams of headless women, blood, of betrayal. Spoke in his sleep, sometimes laughing, sometimes sobbing. Servants told of nights when the king would suddenly bolt upright in bed, eyes wide with terror, crying out names. Catherine, Jane, called to the wives he had buried, discarded, or destroyed. Sometimes, plain they stood in the corner of his chamber, watching. He'd shout at the shadows, for them to leave, them to forgive him, them apologize. And when morning came, he remembered nothing. Court fell silent around him. Once, nobles and poets fought to be near him. Now they whispered in corridors, dreading his summons, because being too close to the king in these years meant walking a knife's edge. One wrong word, one perceived insult, and you could be imprisoned, tortured, executed. Dozens of nobles fell during these final years, their heads decorating the tower like grim reminders of mercy lost. Even Thomas Cromwell, Henry's most loyal advisor, the man who had helped engineer the break from Rome, was not safe. Henry turned on him too, accused him of treason, sent him to the block. The man who had built the king's power was destroyed by it. And through it all, Henry ate. Food became his only comfort. Mountains of meat, custards, puddings, roast swans, eel pies. He consumed in excess, often needing to be carried to the table. Special chairs were built, special clothes sewn. His waist grew to over 50 inches. He weighed nearly 400 pounds in his final years. His face bloated, his hands swollen and purple. He was no longer a man, he was a monument to self-destruction. Even his relationship with his children had soured. He had a son now, Edward, but the boy was distant, almost ceremonial. Henry rarely saw him. Mary, his daughter with Catherine, had once been his joy, but now she was a reminder of the wife he had banished. Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, was kept at arm's length, brilliant, sharp, dangerous. She looked too much like her mother. The palace grew cold, the rooms darker, the halls emptier. Henry VIII, once the center of English life, had become a dying sun, collapsing in on itself. No one dared speak the word death around him. He refused to discuss it. He believed somehow that his will alone would keep the end away, but his body knew. The rot, the swelling, the shallow breath, it all told the truth. He was dying, slowly, horribly, and yet, even as he decayed, he still gave orders, still demanded executions, still signed laws, still controlled lives from a bed that smelled of infection and decay. There was no dignity left. The king had become a prisoner of his own throne, a man whose body was his punishment, whose mind was haunted by every ghost he had created. And the whispers around the court, once full of praise, now spoke only of horror. He's mad, they said. He's cursed. Once loved by millions, Henry VIII now died alone in a room too large for mercy. No music played, no laughter echoed, only the crackling of fire, the dripping of melted wax, and the rustle of rats behind the walls. The prince who once danced beneath golden chandeliers had become a monster in the dark, and every flicker of candlelight only revealed how far he had fallen. It was winter. Cold seeped into the walls of Whitehall Palace like a creeping hand. Outside, the River Thames had frozen in places. Inside, the fires burned low, and in the king's bedchamber, death came slowly, not in a heroic blaze, not in ceremony, but in silence, in stink, in breathless, choking hours. Henry VIII was dying. By January of 1547, he could no longer walk. He could barely speak. His body swollen, foul, half-rotted, lay still beneath heavy covers. The ulcers on his leg had deepened to the bone. The room stank of pus, blood, and old meat. Physicians tried to drain the wound, but the body fought back. His fever surged. His heart beat unevenly. He slipped in and out of sleep, whispering nonsense. Some nights he spoke Latin prayers. Other nights, He begged forgiveness from God, from Catherine, from Anne, from no one. Once, a servant swore he saw the king reach out into thin air, eyes wide, as if seeing someone only he could see. "Catherine?" he whispered. "Catherine ... I'm sorry." They said he cried. They said he saw them, the wives, the dead, the forgotten. Some standing, some bleeding, some weeping, all silent, but no priest dared confront him. He refused last rites, refused to admit he was dying. To speak of death was treason, even in that final hour. He believed, even in agony, that his will could bend the will of God, but God was not listening. January 28, 1547, sometime in the early hours, Henry VIII died, alone, unforgiven, unshriven, the most powerful man in England rotting in his own bed. And then the horror truly began. His body could not be moved for days. It was too swollen, too fragile. Royal protocols demanded elaborate preparation. But nature doesn't wait for politics. As his corpse lay in its linen wrappings, the gases of decay built inside him. The royal doctors tried to keep the room cold, but it wasn't enough. His abdomen, already bloated, began to swell further, and then his body exploded. Literally. The abdomen burst open, releasing a flood of black, reeking liquid onto the floor beneath the coffin. The stench was so powerful that guards vomited in the hallway. The walls had to be scrubbed. The stone beneath his bed was permanently stained. The servants spoke of it in hushed tones. The king, so proud, so obsessed with strength and cleanliness, died in filth. He who feared weakness most had become the very image of decay. And then came the irony. As the bloated body was transported to Windsor for burial, his procession stopped overnight at Sion Abbey, a former monastery Henry had once destroyed during his break with the church. He had taken the land, scattered the monks, and turned the house of prayer into property. Now it held his coffin. At night, dogs broke into the room. One account recorded by a Protestant martyrologist claimed the dogs licked the leaked fluids from beneath the wooden casket. As if, the chronicler wrote, God would not be mocked, and thus let the hounds consume the tyrant's blood. Truth or legend, no one can say, but the story spread like wildfire. The mighty King of England, devoured by dogs on ground he had stolen. Poetic punishment, a warning, a symbol. And yet, the ceremony continued. He was buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, in a vault beneath the choir, beside his true wife, Jane Seymour, the only one who had given him a son. There was no great funeral speech, no national mourning that lasted months, just silence, reluctant respect, and a quiet sense of relief. The monster was dead, but he did not rest. In the years that followed, stories emerged. Ghost stories. Some swore they saw his bloated form walking halls of Hampton Court, dragging one leg, leaving blood in his path. Others claimed they heard sobbing in the chapel where Jane lay buried, not hers. His. And in dreams, across generations, Henry appeared, not as the Golden Prince, as the swollen, twisted, mad king. Eyes wide with fear, mouth open in scream, face both human and inhuman. Not remembered, haunted, because the legacy he left behind was more shadow than light. He had broken the church, burned monasteries, beheaded 2 wives, dozens of advisors, thousands of innocents. He turned England into a land of silence and suspicion, where loyalty could be fatal, where power was both throne and guillotine. Yes, he left a son, but Edward was sickly and died young. Yes, he left daughters, but only Elizabeth would rise. And when she did so by walking through the ashes of her father's destruction. Even his physical legacy, his portraits, his palaces, his tomb refused to hide the truth. We look into those paintings and see the eyes, the carefully shaped beard, the majestic stance, armor that masked the wound. King who demanded control even in how he was. Remembered, history sees through costume. As the body explodes. The blood stains. The dogs come. And the ghosts don't go away. History remembers Henry VIII in fragments. In paintings, see him as a symbol of strength, broad chest, squared jaw, fist resting on a jeweled hilt. In textbooks, he's a monarch who changed the course of English history. In popular culture, he's a tyrant with a crown and a temper, no more. for his wives than for his wars. These are shadows on a wall distorted, echoes of the real man. 'Cause behind the armor was flesh. And behind the throne was fear. What Henry VIII teaches us is not just about kingship or religion or the birth of the Church of England. It's about the terrifying truth of unchecked power. At the height of his rule, he was adored, worshipped, and obeyed without question, reigned like a god. In his heart, Henry was always a man with insecurities, man with wounds, man who chased perfection with a sword in one hand and a prayer book in the other, wanted to be remembered. He never wanted to be truly known. Same hands that composed love songs signed death warrants. Same lips that kissed his wives' foreheads also sentenced them to die. The same man who loved music and art and theology became one of the most feared tyrants in English memory. It didn't happen all at once. Tyranny never does. It began with disappointment, then obsession, then justification, then blood. And soon, he was surrounded by silence. No one dared challenge him. And when no one challenges power, power forgets its own limits. Henry VIII believed that because he wore the crown, God was on his side. That every decision, no matter how cruel, was righteous. That because he was chosen, he could not be wrong. And that is the most dangerous belief any leader can hold. Historian David Starkey once wrote, Henry was a king of presence. He ruled by being seen. But the man who loved being looked at spent his final years hiding from his own reflection. There is no glory in dying alone. No triumph in ruling a kingdom of fear. No peace in a legacy soaked in betrayal. Yes, Henry VIII reshaped England. He tore it from the grip of Rome. He laid the foundations for the Protestant Reformation. He strengthened the navy, built palaces, and set the stage for the Elizabethan era. But the cost was staggering. Monasteries burned, innocents hanged, families shattered, queens executed. Power, when left unchecked, consumes not only those beneath it, but the very soul that holds it. And for all his accomplishments, Henry died, terrified. He did not conquer death. He did not outwit time. He died bloated, infected, afraid of the very ghosts he created. This is the final irony of power. It always ends in silence. The throne grows cold. The voice that once commanded nations goes quiet. The body turns to dust, and all that remains is the memory. And memory is cruel. It does not obey crowns. It does not kneel before legacies. It sees the blood beneath the jewels, the tears behind the eyes, the monster inside the man. And perhaps that's the true lesson, that greatness is not measured by conquest or fear or the number of names in a history book. It is measured by mercy. By truth. By how gently power is held. Henry VIII held it with a clenched fist. And he died crushed beneath it.